hand in organizing the conference. Can you hear me well enough?
Yes.
I don't need this, no. I'm very old-fashioned and disrespectful. This is my visual aid right here. That's Rainer Maria Rilke, about whom I will be speaking today. And just a note before I start, the talk shaped up to be a little different than it's kind of advertised in the proposal. As I'm sure most of you know, Gebser's first book was Rilke in Spain. And I'm not going to talk so much about that book in particular, though I'd be happy to answer questions about it, but more about Rilke and Gebser in general. I'm going to try and do 5 major works of Rilke and all the consciousness structures in 45 minutes. And I didn't trust myself to do that ad hoc, so I actually did write out a paper, which I'm going to read, which I don't usually do. I probably could have given the talk after I wrote the paper without the paper, but once I went through the trouble of writing it, I think I'm going to go through the trouble of reading it. So bear with me. It should take about 40 minutes at a decent clip. But there's poetry in it, so we should be all right. Rilke in Spain and beyond. Rilke counts as a point of departure, even origin, for Gebser himself. Gebser first articulates the kernel of his integral vision in Rilke in Spain. In that book, Gebser suggests that Rilke's linked experiences of the Spanish landscape and El Greco's paintings catalyzed his eventual completion of the Duino Elegies, and so marked a crucial turning point in the poet's life work. Rilke in Spain offers Gebser's interpretation of the gist of that breakthrough, adumbrating Gebser's own vision of an aperspectival consciousness. That said, the connection between Rilke and Gebser may be still deeper and more comprehensive than Gebser himself imagined. I'd suggest that the unfolding of Rilke's thought, as mirrored in the arc of his major works, reflects a pattern of ordered progression through the 5 foundational structures of consciousness that comprise the core of Gebser's philosophy of culture. The major works in question include Rilke's Book of Hours, prayers spoken in the persona of an icon-painting Russian monk, his Rodin-influenced New Poems, which inaugurated the genre of the Dingedicht, or thing poem, his unorthodox novel, The Notebooks of Malte Laurids Brigge, his prophetic lament, the Duino Elegies, and a cycle of Petrarchan sonnets addressed to the god of poetry, Sonnets to Orpheus. As these brief descriptions indicate, Rilke's oeuvre exhibits a remarkable degree of stylistic heterogeneity. Indeed, Stefan Zweig marveled at how Rilke reinvented himself in each of his signal accomplishments, a dynamic evocative of those formative leaps of consciousness or mutations so central to Gebser's philosophy of culture. The writing of the aforementioned major works spanned more than 2 decades, and as I have listed exactly 5, it may be tempting to propose a simple correlation between the order of these works and Gebser's structures of consciousness. To imagine that the Book of Hours exhibits a special affinity with the archaic consciousness structure, the New Poems with the magical, Malte the mythical, the Elegies the mental, and the Sonnets the aperspectival or integral consciousness structure. Such a scheme cannot but represent a gross oversimplification. Nonetheless, there's ground to suppose that it may be anything but frivolous. Rilke, after all, combined the attributes of the consummate artist and spiritual pilgrim. His poetic oeuvre represents the fruit of an intensively sustained contemplation of the fundamentals of human being, concretized in literary form. If Gebser in fact elaborates the essential structures of human consciousness, it should not be surprising to find the patterning of those structures echoed in the underlying order of Rilke's life work. I will, therefore, employ the above-mentioned correspondences as a working hypothesis, one that can help organize a Gebserian review of the trajectory of Rilke's poetic opus, as long as this hypothesis is duly modified by 2 crucial qualifications. First, it must be recognized that each of Rilke's major works represents a complex and its own way integral work of art and consequently exhibits features of all of the consciousness structures, so that the proposed correspondence expresses accent but not exclusivity. Secondly, all of Rilke's works take as their inevitable point of departure the mode of consciousness peculiar to a modern poet, and so that of a human being dedicated to the mythopoetic world of soul by virtue of his vocation, and, coincidentally, one condemned to confront the existential problems characteristic of the late, deficient phase of the mental consciousness structure. Rilke wrote the Book of Hours, which is actually comprised of 3 related but distinct books, around the turn of the century in the aftermath of formative voyages to Russia, Rilke's adopted spiritual homeland, with his lover, Lou Andreas Salome. Rilke himself called the Book of Hours his first undateable work, the first arising from a stratum of consciousness transcending historical time. Critics have generally followed Rilke's own lead in regarding it as his first distinctive accomplishment, and thus the natural point of departure for informed readings of the poet's oeuvre. Spiritual homeland, undateable work, point of departure. Such phrases suggest that the Book of Hours represents not so much the beginning of the Rilkean opus, Rilke published a great deal before 1899, as its initiating leap of poetic faith, its Ursprung, or origin. Well, it would be foolish to imagine that the Book of Hours might represent anything like Gebser's originative archaic consciousness in a pristine or unmixed form. I would propose that an archaic sense of origin does in fact pervade and even engender Rilke's Book of Hours, one that flows from the peculiarly intimate relation between the human being, the world, and God that founds and grounds the text, a relation so intimate indeed as to suggest an underlying identity. Such identity virtually defines Gebser's archaic consciousness, which harkens back, to employ Gebser's own mythic metaphor, to the paradisal or Edenic state wherein man and woman are not much distinguished from either God or nature, but seamlessly identified with their spiritual material surround. To speak of any truly undifferentiated identity between the self, God, and the all in the Book of Hours would be an impermissible exaggeration. The very existence of the poem and the premises inscribed in its generic mode presuppose differences that are foreign to archaic consciousness. The icon painting monk can't be simply identified with the God to whom he addresses his prayers, or the world of things he paints in his poetic pictures. And yet, some deep reminiscence of the ground of identity that does subsist between them, a tangible sense of the primordial root out of which all differentiated forms of consciousness emerge, does present itself as an enabling and originative truth of the poem, an archaic truth abiding below the layers of magical, mythical, and mental meanings inscribed in it. Listen, for instance, to this, the second poem of the first of the 3 books of Hours. Ich lebe mein Leben in wachsenden Ringen, die sich über die Dinge ziehen. Ich werde die letzte vielleicht nicht vollbringen, aber versuche will ich ihn. Ich kreise um Gott, um den uralten Turm, und ich kreise Jahrtausende lang und weiß noch nicht, bin ich ein Falke, ein Sturm oder ein großer Gesang. I live my life in widening circles that reach out across all things, high and low. The last one I may never complete, but will attempt it even so. I circle around God, the primordial tower, circle thousands of years long, and still don't know, am I a falcon, a storm, or am I a great song? Like all of Rilke's poems, this one is firmly centered in the soul, The motion of endless circling invoked in it is, according to Gebser, the very signature of soul's mythopoetic life. Yet what is it exactly that the soul is seeking here? Note the linguistic roots of the all-important adjective which describes the tower, metaphorically identified with God in the 5th line of the poem. Alt means literally so old, alt, as to hearken back to the origin, or, as in that text closest to the Creator's own hand, or as in that most ancient Sumerian city. What the poetic soul is seeking in the Book of Hours is archaic truth, the ground of the common origin of the self and its song with God and the things of the world. And I still don't know, am I a falcon, a storm, or am I a great song? The implication is that the self is no one of these any more than any of the other, is in essence all, or at the least is eternally searching for recollection of that archaic truth of things, that primordial well from which all else springs. The origin may also be figured as the root of all being, and so it is in the next 3rd poem of the cycle. In the first stanza, the Russian monk distances himself from the light-filled, human-formed divinity of his Italian brethren. In the second, he concludes, "But when I lean over the chasm of myself, it seems my God is dark and like a web, 100 roots silently drinking. This is the ferment I grow out of. More I don't know, because my branches rest in deep silence, stirred only by the wind." The translation is by Anita Barrows and Joanna Macy. This poem, like the whole of the Book of Hours, offers a radically unorthodox image of God, one quite incommensurate with the Judeo-Christian tradition which in large measure birthed it. Rather than some transcendent, all-knowing, and omnipotent Father in heaven, Rilke's God is a dark, webbed, maternal matrix, one with a deeply unconscious source of natural life and growth, and virtually identified, too, with the self, the I, which is little more than the visible extension of that same source. God, self, and world are the root, trunk, and crown of one indivisible tree of life, and the consciousness indwelling that tree knows nothing more than the fact of that living identity, is, in accord with the nature of archaic consciousness, sunk in the deep sleep of vegetative process. While I focused here on the archaic elements of the Book of Hours, the work also reveals powerfully magical features. The book's original title was, after all, simply Gebete, prayers. And for Gebser, prayer, insofar as it aims to achieve a tangible effect, qualifies as a fundamentally magical act, a fact aptly illustrated by the close of the very first poem, which presents itself as both utterance and painterly icon. "Nothing is too small for me to love and paint great on a background of gold. I hold it high and know not whose soul it will break from the mold." Or, in a somewhat more literal reading of the German, "whose soul it will set free." Can you conceive of a more magical act? In the fall of 1902, 2 years after returning from the Russian voyages that engendered his Book of Hours, Rilke, who had been hobnobbing with painters and sculptors in a remote art colony in the North German moorlands, earned a commission to write a monograph on the sculptor Auguste Rodin. After his consequential move to the alien urban metropolis of Paris, the young, still largely unknown poet adopted the renowned old master as mentor, assiduously studying his artistic methods and self-consciously taking Rodin's credo, toujours travailler, always work, to heart. That mantra conveys much about Rodin. a driven and prodigiously prolific artist whose marble or bronze figures embody the enormous, often erotically charged vitality that coursed through the life of their creator. Insofar as Gebser's magical consciousness structure accents emotional drive and the vital power of the deed, especially the deed of making, the sculptor's living example proved an effective means of initiating our rather delicate poet into a new order of consciousness, one that reveals itself to be still more concretely centered in the magical act of creation than the Book of Hours. Generically speaking, certainly, the two works are drastically different. The poem prayers that comprise the Book of Hours aren't designed to stand alone as discrete art objects. None are titled, and they flow quasi-liturgically one into the other in a kind of seamless whole. Quite the opposite holds true for Rilke's new poems, each one of which boasts a title that is often simply the name of the thing the poem sets out to realize. Blue hydrangea, Roman fountain, the bowl of roses, the panther. In Rilke's able hands, moreover, these mostly everyday objects hardly remain ordinary, rather in accord with the pars pro toto, or part for the whole, dynamic which Gebser links to magical consciousness. Each of Rilke's Dinggedichte, or thing poems, reaches out from the confines of its singularity to encompass the intertwined nexus of a whole world, presents itself as a microcosm of reality. Listen, for instance, to how Rilke's description of a cathedral in the poem so named, you don't have this on the sheet, so named, draws the whole universe into the physical substance of the thing itself. There was birth in this foundation block, and strength and thrust in this soaring rock, and love like bread and wine everywhere, and portals full of love's provender. Life tarried in the steady clock, and in the towers that, full of surrender, suddenly ceased climbing. Death was there. Correlatively, Rilke's best Dinggedichte incorporate in the point-like dimensionality of their singular existence an essentially timeless and spaceless continuum of being. Regardless of where or when it was composed, we may read a Rilke poem and feel its magic work upon us anywhere, anytime. Take, for example, this famous sculptural piece, and this you do have on the sheet. Archaic torso of Apollo. We never knew his unheard of head, wherein the eye apples ripened. Still, his torso glows like a street lamp, fed by the gaze that, but turned in, will always hold its fire. Else the surge of the breast couldn't blind you, or the gentle twist of the loins reveal the invisible urge to smile that shudders through creation's midst. Else this stone would stand deformed and knifed off at the shoulder's steep rock face, and not ripple like a panther's fluid pelt, and not burst through foam's constricting belt like a shining star. For there is no place that does not see you. You must change your life. Note, first of all, that even while the visual art of the poem, no less than the presence of the sun god it depicts, manifests a mental dimension, visible contour, and indeed space itself ultimately implode into the vital center of the poem, the erogenous zone of the god that is nothing but pure energy. Indeed, the first two stanzas of the poem trace a descent from the significantly non-existent head to the chamber of the heart, torso and breast, to the vital center, the loins, seat of pure procreative power, power that bursts the bounds of time and space to become a force, like all true eros, at once natural and cosmic. And we are speaking here of effective energy, the conjuring of power that can alter the course of events and even change a life. These not-so-little Rilke poems often act like totemic objects, and I personally can attest to the reality of the transformative force loaded into the imperative at the end of this one. A student at Cornell, unsure of the path my graduate studies might take, it was a professor of comparative literature who, proclaiming, "Du musst dein Leben ändern," you must change your life, who recruited me into his department so that 30 years later I stand here at this podium speaking to you about the magic of Rilke's new poems. Let me mention two more closely related signal features of these poems. As we've seen, the new poems focus intently upon a largely objective, even external world. Correlatively, the ego, the self-conscious subject, recedes from view as its centripetal energy disperses among the multiple objects of its attention. Parsing the magical structure of consciousness, Gebser writes, "The as yet uncentered I is scattered over the world of phenomena. All that still sleeps in the soul is, for the magical human being, first awake in the outer world. Here lies the root of that pluralization of the soul that is a reality for the magical human being. In a certain sense, one could say that this structure of consciousness is not yet in the human being, but rather still rests in the world." All apropos and instructive in relation to the new poems. In accordance with the alternating rhythm Gebser ascribes to his consciousness structures, Rilke's next major work breathes the world deeply, very deeply, back in. So, one does come here in order to live. I would have sooner thought one died here. I have been out. I saw hospitals. I saw a man who swayed and sank to the ground. People gathered round him, so I was spared the rest. I saw a pregnant woman. She was pushing herself cumbrously along a high, warm wall, groping for it now and again as if to convince herself it was still there. And yes, it was still there. And behind it, I looked on my map. Maison de couchement. Good. They will deliver her. They know how. Thus begins the notebooks of Malte, Laurids, Briggen. First published in 1910, the origin of the novel dates back to the poet's early days in Paris. Composed in the form of journal entries penned by the fictitious protagonist, a young Danish writer recently moved to Paris, the almost plotless novel records young Malte's experiences of his new and alien urban environment, recollections of his Danish childhood, reflections on Ibsen, Beethoven, and the vocation of the artist, French history, and much more. By way of its often seemingly disordered melange of experience, recollection, and speculation, the book conveys the private saga of Malte's soul, articulates his innermost hopes and dreams and his deepest fears, most powerfully and poignantly the obsessive fears of dispossession and of death that haunt his frangible psyche and palpably threaten his sanity. Often clearly autobiographical in content and concern, the book is just as clearly no factual memoir, but imaginative invention, what psychologist James Hillman calls healing fiction. And so, after his excursion into the outer world of things in the new poems, in Malte, Rilke turns decisively inward, plunging deep into the element of soul itself. I have an inner self, of which I was ignorant. Everything goes thither now. What happens there, I don't know. And this plunge into soul means, too, plumbing the nature of the complementary polarities that, a la Gebser, comprise its essence. Why do hospitals, the first thing Malte sees when he ventures out into Paris, and the chief subject of any number of subsequent journal entries, figures so prominently in Malte's imagination? Like the juxtaposed images of the man sinking to the ground and the pregnant woman about to give birth, hospital existence revolves around the two master poles of the soul, the entrance into life and its inevitable cessation, birth and death. So, one does come here in order to live. I would have sooner thought one died here. The genre of the novel is, generically speaking, modernity's most literate version of the ancient myth-making epic, Inanna, Gilgamesh, the Odyssey, and Rilke's Malte unfolds a variant of one of the 5 great mythologies Gebser singles out for mention in the ever-present origin, the Negia, or descent into Hades. For the delicate Malte, urban Paris, featuring ghostly white-clad specters appearing and disappearing in hospital windows, epileptics crumpling on bridges, and a blind man repeatedly shouting, "Chauffeur, chauffeur," cauliflower, assumes the guise of an infernal city. Whether or not Malte does, in fact, successfully emerge from that underworld remains ambiguous. The book's conclusion is so open-ended that Rilke had difficulty deciding between 2 entirely different versions. In any event, in reweaving such classically mythic material, Rilke's modernist novel, like kindred masterpieces, Remembrance of Things Past, To the Lighthouse, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, works creatively with the principal element of the mythic consciousness structure, namely time, revealing it to be what in truth it is, no extrinsic spatialized category of perception, but a plastic medium of memory and imagination, ductile vessel of the immeasurably rich inner life of the soul. For Rilke, Malte proved a transformative but profoundly taxing accomplishment, and the period following the novel's completion was marked by poetic infertility and intense personal crisis. In August of 1910, the poet wrote to his patroness, the Princess Marie von Thurn and Taxis Hohenlohe. Wouldn't you like a name like that? I shudder a little when I think of all the violence I put through in Malte Laurids, how I landed with him back of everything in consistent despair, so that nothing more was possible, not even dying. As fate would have it, Princess Marie played a material role in the event that signaled the resolution of Rilke's creative crisis. In January 1912, at her castle above the little town of Duino, just east of Trieste, Rilke, striding along battlements perched on limestone cliffs high above the blue Adriatic, heard a voice that heralded the next leap on his soul's path. Wer, wenn ich schrie, hörte mich denn aus der Engel Ordnungen? Who, if I cried, would hear me among the angelic orders? The Duino Elegies may be Rilke's most famous poem, may also be his most difficult. The genre of the elegy, grappling as it does with grievous loss, lends itself to metaphysical reflection, and Rilke's massive cycle unfolds an intensely self-reflective train of thought and emotion, a sustained and passionate contemplation of the conditions of human existence. While vivid imagery naturally remains integral, abstraction abounds. Whole swaths of language are devoid of reference to actual things, and the poet often offers highly complex thought sequences summed by a cryptic intellectual formula or philosophy, which sometimes proves so rarefied as to border on a koan-like senselessness. Nothing is what it is, always world and never nowhere without no. The deeply philosophical texture of Rilke's Duino Elegies patently brands this poem as an exemplary product of the mental consciousness structure. Nor, as perhaps could be inferred from the negation-riddled lines just cited, is it any old form of mental consciousness that engenders Rilke's cycle, but the soul-wrenching existential dilemmas intrinsic to the modern, deficient phase of that structure. According to Gebser, fixed duality, as opposed to the rhythmic complementarity of myth, characterizes the mental consciousness structure, the late deficient phase of which exhibits a hypertrophy of this tendency, einen wesentlich verstärkten Dualismus, an essentially strengthened dualism, that drives an unyielding wedge between all the critical poles of existence, spirit and matter, heaven and earth, subject and object, life and death. This splitting in two of the universe gives rise to the condition of profound isolation native to the modern self, the horrifying alienation graphically illustrated in many iconic works of modern art, including the famous Edvard Munch lithograph, which, like the opening of Rilke's Elegies, dramatically foregrounds the abysmal angst implicit in the open-mouthed figure of the scream. And the German in the first line of the Elegies is actually wer wenn ich schrie, Schrei, which is the title of the Munch lithograph. That schreien or Schrei is the same word in both. Although that first line of the Elegies usually isn't translated with the word scream, but it is that same word. After the first Elegies initiating cry or scream gives anguished voice to his separation from the spiritual world, symbolized by the angel, the poem's speaker continues to lament his like estrangement from other human beings and the earthly world. Alas, to whom can we turn? Not angels, not human beings, and the knowing animals readily sense how little we feel at home in our interpreted world. The poem complains of other alienating schisms as well. Later in the first elegy, the speaker laments the fact that, quite unlike angels who don't divide the realms of life and death, living human beings make the mistake of drawing too sharp distinctions between these realms. In the eighth elegy, decrying how the human subject remains always at an irreconcilable remove from the things of the world, the poet exclaims, Das heißt Schicksal, gegenüber sein und nichts als das, und immer gegenüber. That is what fate means, being opposite and nothing but that, and always being opposite. Heaven versus earth, life versus death, subject versus object. The speaker of the Elegies portrays human consciousness as riven between the polarized extremes of existence, crucified by the agonizing tension implicit in modernity's rigid dualism. And yet, if Rilke had stopped there, it's hard to believe that Jean Gebser would have viewed Rilke's poem as a dark window that opens onto the light of a new world. As the often paradoxical language of the elegy already implies, Rilke doesn't intensify the dualism underlying the modern frame of mind in order to reinforce it. On the contrary, he does so in order to push it to and beyond the breaking point, and so discover, beyond the splintered threshold of its deficient mental consciousness, a new inner world space, a Weltinnenraum, wherein the seemingly irreconcilable opposites, like parallel lines drawn out to infinity, bend together and rejoin in a new, more integral dimension, an aperspectival universe wherein spirit and matter, divine and human being, life and death, while not exactly one and the same, are not simply and irrevocably two. To gain perhaps a glimpse of that world, to the threshold of which Rilke's elegies deliver us, let us turn finally to the poet's culminating work, his sonnets to Orpheus. While Rilke received the initiating inspiration for his elegies at Duino in 1912, he only completed 2 of the cycle's 10 elegies at that time. Much of the next decade, torn by the ravages of World War I, found Rilke struggling in vain to make further progress. He didn't, in fact, finish the elegies till February 22, when, ensconced in a small medieval chateau in Switzerland, our poet enjoyed an astonishing burst of creativity, one triggered by the spontaneous arising of an entirely unexpected opus, a sonnet sequence dedicated to the memory of a young dancer and addressed to the god of poetry. At the end of 3 fateful weeks, Rilke had finished the 2-part cycle of 55 sonnets to Orpheus and, at long last, his Duino Elegies. Although in some sense the 2 are twin works, the origin of the elegies predates that of the sonnets by a full decade, and in many respects the 2 cycles are profoundly different, indeed dramatically contrasting works of art. We've heard the opening of the elegies. Listen now to that of the sonnets. A tree rose up, O pure transcendence, O Orpheus sings, O tall tree in the ear, and everything hushed. Yet in that quiet cadence, new transformations were beginning to appear. What a difference between the peaceful yet pregnant hush that ushers in the world of this poem and the anguished cry that opens the elegies. In the introduction to my new translation of the sonnets, I compare the effects of these lines with those that initiate the Duino cycle. Immediately, we enter an altogether different poetic universe. No gigantic Vatic gesture, rather a series of short, quick brushstrokes. No existential angst couched in sweeping rhetorical question, but a straightforward declarative followed by 3 brief apostrophes that double as celebratory exclamation. We encounter a poem keyed, then, to a tone of praise of what is present, rather than distressed lament of what is not. What accounts for this radical mutation? The pure transcendence announced and celebrated in the sonnets might be construed as the alchemical dissolution of all those rigidly fixed dualities characteristic of a deficient mental consciousness. The sonnet's 2nd stanza, in fact, transports the reader of the poem to what the poet calls den klaren gelösten Wald. As is familiar from fairy tale, a forest or wood, Wald, functions as an archetypal image of the state of the soul itself. Thus, Rilke's figure of a clear wood, freed or released, gelösten means literally loosed or dissolved, from the binding and blinding spell of instinctual habits of perception, introduces us to the transfigured experience of being that is the no longer opaque, but clear world of the poem. Getting there. The rest of the first sonnet reads, creatures of calm thronged out of the clear, reed forest, out of the nest and den, and it so happened that it was neither fear nor cunning that made them quiet then, but listening. Growl and roar, shriek and hiss seemed small inside their hearts, and where there had been barely a hut to receive all this, a lean-to made of darkest love and fearing, with an entrance that shivers in the air, you built them temples deep inside their hearing. In the peculiarly translucent world of Rilke's sonnets, we don't find spirit and nature or any other pair of opposites split or pulled apart. Rather, even as the spell of Orphic song, at once heard and imagined, magical and mythical music and poetry, magnetically draws the animals toward the divine being of the god, the poem reveals the realms of nature and of spirit in a process of reunion and communion, a deep recollection of common origin. The mention of origin brings us back to Gebser, whose elucidation of the integral consciousness structure has already been put in play in this discussion of the sonnets. For attainment of integral consciousness, Gebser emphasized, entails effective integration of non-deficient forms of all the prior consciousness structures. Gebser, where the forms of representation characteristic of the rationalistic phase of mental consciousness are superseded, the magical can once more be heard, the mythical imagined, and the mental limited to its rightful sphere of conceptual representation. And indeed, powerful, archaic, magical, mythical, and mental elements have all already emerged into the space of this brief discussion of the first sonnet, which reveals Orpheus himself as the work's mythopoetic center, whose silently ubiquitous song exerts a compelling magical force that, as sonnet number 19 asserts, ultimately bears all things home to archaic source, heim zu Uraltem, the same word that appeared in the Book of Hours. These are cues, preliminary indications of just how integral Rilke's sonnets to Orpheus truly are. And so it's no accident that I've already drawn attention to how Rilke's sonnets, in contrast to the elegies, highlight what is present rather than what is not. Gegenwärtigung, awkwardly translated as presentiation, is a hallmark of Gebser's integral consciousness, as is the quality of transparency or translucence I've ascribed to the sonnets. Whether we're presented with the mythic image of Orpheus charming the animals, the natural phenomena of a flower folding its petals, or a white horse hobbling across open meadows at dusk, a young dancer moving fluidly through space, or invited to contemplate the interweaving of being and non-being in the image of a ringing glass that shatters even as it rings. A clear light shines through the dark matter of Rilke's sonnets. Let me close them by reciting one more. This is on the sheet. Sing the gardens, my heart, unknown to you yet, as if in glass poured gardens, inaccessible, clear. Fountains and roses from Isfahan or Shiraz, blissfully sing of them, praise them like none other here. Show, my heart, that you never lack them, that they're intended for you, they're ripening figs, that you converse with the breezes rising between the blossoming twigs, conjuring almost a face, a flower, a gem. Avoid the illusion that life might be rent by the decision once taken to be. Silken thread, you became part of the weaving. Whatever image you own inwardly, be it a moment of pain or deep grieving, feel that the whole, the marvelous carpet, is meant. I choose this sonnet on account of the overt diaphaneity imagined in the opening lines, those gardens of the heart, clear as if poured in glass. I choose it too on account of the closing line and its poetic affirmation of Gebser's integral vision. Whatever image you own inwardly, feel that the whole, the marvelous carpet is meant. Welchem der Bilder du auch im Innern geeint bist, fühl, dass der ganze, der rühmliche Teppich gemeint ist. Thank you. Questions, or if we have to move on.
Would you be willing to write a book comparing and exploring and responding to the relationship of Rilke, Lou Salome, and Friedrich Nietzsche? And in particular, responding to tonality and Zarathustra compared to tonality?
Well, as far as Rilke and Lou Andreas Salome is concerned, you can start with the big one right away. I'll sell it to anyone for $25 because I don't want to bring them home. It does go through a lot of this, and I do have another book coming out in January called Rilke, which is a fun book, and if you don't have a postcard, please pick one up. It's coming out from the same publisher that did the big book, and it was actually written a number of years ago when I was first out of graduate school and went to the places Rilke lived and worked in Switzerland and France, and then came back and was part of anti-death penalty work in Houston. So there was a dramatic contrast there, and I look at the death penalty against the background of Rilke's work. So that's going to be a fun book. So there's more to come.
You take on Nietzsche in the Green Book.
I don't do that much with Nietzsche. Nietzsche's an interesting because, of course, he was very close to Louis Andreas Salome. You know, Louis Andreas Salome I do a lot in the book because one of the most glaring deficiencies of most Rilke criticism is that while Louis Salome's role as an emotional and romantic partner to Rilke is recognized, and she was immensely important to his maturation, her intellectual contribution to the formation of his consciousness really isn't credited, and she was absolutely fundamental to that. She was writing essays urged to do so by Nietzsche on philosophy and religion in the 90s, and in the time of Rilke and Louis Salome's closest relationship, and they were lovers, she was steeped in that. And Rilke was reading all that and talking with her about it all the time. And if you want to understand the theology in the Book of Hours, and I go through this in great detail in the big book, what you need to understand is Louis Salome's psychology of religion, because that really becomes the foundation of his mature spirituality. And it's a shame that more of her stuff isn't translated. It's actually fairly turgid, which is probably one of the reasons why. I think it also has to do, lamentably, with the fact that she's a woman, and that her intellectual stature has not really been justly recognized, because she's a very important intellectual figure, in addition to, of course, her relationships with the triumvirate, jaw-dropping triumvirate of Nietzsche, Rilke, and Freud. She then became a confidant of Freud and one of the earliest analysts, and always confessed that she felt that the gist of her career as a psychologist was premised on her unofficial counseling of Rilke and her knowledge of his psyche, which she performed in the role of a friend and confidant over a lifetime. Yeah. Yes?
I just want to thank you.
Yeah, very good.
Bless you. This was an exquisite elucidation, a poetic elucidation of Gebser's structures of consciousness, and I'm deeply moved. I'm tearing. I love Rilke anyway. And your translations and your amplification, bringing the two together, is exquisite. And just on the very last sonnet here, for me, what gets powerfully evoked is a sort of Islamic mysticism, Sufism, with the Shiraz and the Isfahan, and the thread is almost like the geometric face of God, and the carpet, the magic carpet. And
yes. Of course, in the Elegies, Rilke said explicitly in a letter that the figure of the angel in the Elegies is not really taken from the Christian tradition, but more from the Islamic tradition. And there's a lot about that in the big book, the idea of theophany that comes from Henry Corbin. Corbin was, of course, one of the godfathers of archetypal psychology, so the notion of his imaginal world, I talk a great deal about that. It's also in the Book of Hours. I talk about the Book of Hours in the dialogue, the creative prayer between the self and God in that. So I hope there's just a rampage to get who's going to carry the big book home, because it's all in there.
And in Spain, you have that whole belly of Moorish Spain, and Ibn al-Arabi
Yes.
is giving birth to the imaginal
Yeah,
world.
and that's why
under
Gebser
review.
moved to Spain. He was following in Rilke's footsteps, and that's kind of the essence of Rilke in Spain. And it was interesting. I wrote a chapter in the book about El Greco and Toledo and how profoundly it influenced Rilke and how. I never read anything very intelligent about that, and then I discovered, Gebser. I got onto Gebser through the Rilke connection, and he says very similar things about Rilke in Spain. I mean, he's very much resonant with that. It's a crucial chapter, and it really is Gebser's origin, as he admits that search in Spain to find out Rilke's sense of the unity of life and death and heaven and earth, as was pictorialized in El Greco's Angels and his landscape of Toledo.
That's a perfect point of transition.
Yes.
To the next one.
Yes.
So it's going to take a few minutes to set up, and then we'll move on.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you.